Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and in a return to form that we used to do a bit of, we've got three of us on the podcast today. So it is Phoebe Watson.
Hello.
And our friend Jacob Moran.
Howdy.
Lovely to have both of you on the podcast. This one is coming a little bit late because Phoebe and I were both traveling to see friends in Chicago, which has pushed this episode out a little bit. And it is, in fact, the last episode of this particular season. We will be taking our usual summer break and we will be back in September as usual. But because it's the last one, I am really thrilled to have our friend Jacob on. He has been, I have been angling to get him on for at least a year.
And I refused quite obstinately because Rachel had not read my favourite book.
And that was your promise, which was that you would come on, but your first episode would have to be about Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. And then I failed to read it for a year. And so we just didn't have you on for a year, which was, a missed opportunity. Also because I then loved reading the book. So this was really a more fool me moment.
This has been a time of wandering in the desert for me. And I'm so glad to have made it to this promised land.
Well, in some ways, it kind of is an interesting promised land because our first interactions, I think we met vaguely once or twice in social settings, but our main first interactions were you sending me very nice messages about how much you were enjoying the podcast.
Let me be clear. I am a Risking Enchantment fan first and Rachel Sherlock friend second. I was interacting. I remember really loving the King Arthur episodes, the Martyrdom episode. I've loved this podcast for a long time. And we have some very formal messages going back and forth.
There was one moment where, because obviously once we properly became friends, we stopped communicating on the Risking Enchantment Instagram messenger and started communicating on personal accounts and also in person. And at one point about, almost a year into us seeing a lot more of each other and being friends, I went back because you messaged, I think I put something on the Instagram stories which you responded to. So I then went and looked at our messages and it's like a whole string of extremely formal, very nice, polite, thank you very much for this episode. Here's a martyr that I really enjoyed, and me saying, I'm very glad, thank you very much, and all of this. And then it follows on with just all caps messages, cheering me on, emojis, very, very familiar kind of messages. And it's like a very hard jump between those two things.
It's one of my favourite time jumps of all time.
So it is really lovely to have you on the podcast. Phoebe has joined us because, unlike me, Phoebe had already read Wives and Daughters when Jacob suggested this.
Yeah, I read Wives and Daughters in college, I think straight after I read North and South. And I was slightly horrified by it, only because it isn't finished. And I was reading it on my Kindle, so I didn't even know I was coming to the end of the book. And then it just stopped. And if anyone's seen the paper copy of this book, it's quite a significant book, so you can tell it is actually like almost at the end. But yeah, I had no idea of this. So that kind of marred my memory of it until Jacob came into our lives and was like, you love North and South, but why can't you talk about Wives and Daughters when you've read it? I'm like, okay, I'll reread it.
I think just you mentioned North and South. It's worth mentioning Elizabeth Gaskell is kind of, in some ways, like if you're into literature, you kind of might know her. North and South is definitely her most famous novel because it has quite a famous BBC adaptation. But even then, it's not exactly in the kind of cultural consciousness.
And the next best known thing is usually Cranford because Judi Dench was in the adaptation. People tend to know that one.
Yeah. And we did an episode on North and South, so I will make sure to link that in the show notes and in the email that I send out. So we do have some Elizabeth Gaskell precedents set on this podcast, but I did come across an article which said that Wives and Daughters has been called, quote, the most neglected novel of its century, and indeed the most underrated novel in English, which really feels like you wrote those quotes, Jacob.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
So I guess maybe we should start with Jacob's pitch of Wives and Daughters, which he is very familiar with giving because he makes everyone read this book.
So I should begin with, yes, Wives and Daughters is a novel. It was published in the 1860s, between 1864 and 1866. And yes, it is unfinished. And this is a selling point in my estimation. The subtitle of this novel is An Everyday Story. Wives and Daughters, An Everyday Story. And I think it lives up to that subtitle. Gaskell just really explores the reality of day-to-day life, of emotions and events buffeting people, and the choices that are made to pursue virtue within those daily occurrences and real events, real circumstances.
And maybe do you want to give us like a summary of the plot? It's like you said, it is, in some ways, this is one of those kind of what I now almost consider the mark of like what is a promising novel, which is it's very hard to convey what the plot is and why you would care about it. And it's only in the reading and in the telling that I think that you really get to grips with what this novel is really trying to do. But for what it's worth, can you give us some summary of the story?
So Wives and Daughters follows Molly Gibson, who is the daughter of a country doctor. Her mother died when she was very young, and it follows her as her father makes the difficult decision to marry again. And the integration of two families and their connections to the great families who live nearby. That's the very basic setting of the novel. It's an examination of families and their relationships. It's an examination of, very particularly, of parental relationships.
Yeah, it's great. And I did really love it. I'm very glad that you got me to read it.
And it's set in the 1830s, isn't it? In like that kind of pre-railroad England.
Yes, and there's some interesting... Gaskell is an author who's very interested in social equality, in the plight of the working class, and you see her politics in the background of this one a little. You see her just touching on themes and touching on class structure and referring to historical things, because at this point she's writing a historical novel. She's writing several decades back, but it's very much hidden within the story rather than North and South. It's very much at the fore.
Yeah.
Some of her other novels like Ruth, it's very much a topic novel, whereas this is a character study and, relationship novel.
Yeah, absolutely. With Molly very much as like the heart of the novel and the heroine that we are following in her various deeds. I have a quote here from an article from The Captive Reader about Wives and Daughters, which I think kind of sets it up quite nicely. She says, "It has everything you could want, romances of every kind, comedy, tragedy, mystery, and delicious secrets, and yet it is not in the least sensational. There are dramas of every sort going on around Molly, but they are of the small domestic kind. Bad marriages are made, and people die of lingering illnesses, but these are the worst things that happen in Molly's world. It is a very human story, very relatable, regardless of the decade or century." And I think what makes it so relatable is what you pointed out already, Jacob, which is this subtitle, An Everyday Story, which I kind of thought was maybe a good basis for our discussion today, because I do think that that's what Gaskell is really driving at. It really highlights to me what I would call the precariousness of the virtuous life, that as much as we feel like our easy, comfortable middle-class life, and like you were saying, that Gaskell has concerns about the working class, I feel like this is a novel that's very much about the middle class and that uneasy straddling between worlds as a country doctor and his family, but that there is this sense of like comfortable lives are actually very difficult to enact true virtue, and how easy it is to tip one way or the other into vice and find yourself off the path of goodness.
And never realise that you strayed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think we need to bring up one of our reoccurring quotes of the podcast at this stage, which is C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where he says, "It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards, if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts." I think you really see that in the petty gossip and the small choosing of your own way that inhibits some of the characters from striving after virtue and from doing good.
And I think we see different levels of that slow, gradual turning away. And we see characters who we're very sympathetic to, who are aware of the choices that they are making. And we see characters who are blithely unaware, who we are not at all sympathetic to. And both equally, falling into vice.
We have spent most of the discussion for this podcast complaining about one particular character and how awful she is.
Yeah, and I thought in some ways, I think the way that I envisaged talking about this book, we are potentially going to touch on some spoilers, especially a little bit later. We'll flag when that section comes up. I always feel like it's a balance. If people don't have a reason to be interested in a book, then they're never going to pick it up. So spoiling it is kind of not particularly an issue. But we will leave the kind of more major plot points towards the end of our discussion. And the way that I thought might be fun to talk about this book is to just focus on the characters, maybe even kind of slightly out of context of their plot. Because like I said, in many ways, the plot is quite light. And so the first two, because I feel like the novel is very full of character foils, that you have one character and you have, not in sort of a big overt comedy way, but if you're paying attention, they're opposite in terms of their failings or their virtues, that there are these contrasts that emerge throughout the novel. And the most fun one to take is of the main character, Molly, who is not at all a saint or without flaws. She does wrestle with things in a very endearing, believable way, but she is essentially the good character, the really truly strong, virtuous character of the book. And we will contrast that with her, eventually she doesn't start this way at the start of the novel, but the woman who becomes her stepmother, then known as Mrs Gibson, previously Miss Kirkpatrick or Claire. But yes, Mrs Gibson is the character that I've demanded that we don't get down too far a rabbit hole of just complaining about.
You said we could go to an hour and 45 minutes and then you cut it.
I even, for preparing for this episode, I did a little table of contrasting their various character types. And so maybe it would be good to just read out some of those. So I said that Molly is a character of action. Her virtue allows her to charge into situations and to act with freedom. And she can kind of rely on her clear conscience and her moral character to carry her into these situations. And she is very much a doing character, whereas
despite the fact that she's also quite quiet in herself, which makes that quite interesting.
Yeah, she's not a forceful personality, but she is just decidedly a person of action in very quiet and self-effacing ways.
And compassionate ways. She's generally moved to action from compassion for the people around her.
Yeah. I do think, if you look at what she does in the novel, it's often, and we're going to come to the squire and his family, but she is often attending people who are sick in that family, or, visiting other people who might be neglected otherwise. She's very much someone who is ready to serve, whereas Mrs. Gibson couldn't be further from that. She is a woman of lethargy. She is a woman who centers her life on enabling her to do as little as possible. Her marriage to Mr. Gibson is mainly based on the fact that she is very tired of having to be a teacher and have pupils, and she just doesn't want to have to work for her keep anymore. And so, leisure and comfort are her main priorities in life. I think one of the things that made me laugh the most was there's a quote about Mrs. Gibson when she's proposed to by Mr. Gibson. Mrs. Kirkpatrick accepted Mr. Gibson principally because she was tired of the struggle of earning her own livelihood. But she liked him personally. Nay, she even loved him in her torpid way.
Ooh. Gaskell's so good at slamming her. Like, her own torpid way.
Yeah.
As a reader, your indignation at Mrs. Gibson and her character will only be matched by Mrs. Gaskell's own indignation at her.
You can just feel Gaskell despising this woman as she writes her.
And I think in comparing the two, Molly is moved out of compassion always, and whereas Mrs. Gibson has one passion, and it is comfort, and she will not be moved by anyone else's.
Yes.
Yeah. Doesn't she get described as like a purring cat at points?
She does, and it is a pox upon cats everywhere.
There's that like idea of just prioritizing her own comfort.
Whereas I think it's really interesting when you think of Molly as a person of action as well, because it really highlights how much virtue is something that you do.
There's a point where she's like serving this family and having to ask quite a lot of the servants in their attendance on the family, and because of that she's being neglected. And it says that if the squire had known of the want of attendance to which she submitted with the most perfect meekness, as far as she herself was the only sufferer, he would have gone into a towering rage. But Molly hardly thought of it. So anxious was she to do all she could for others, and to remember the various charges which her father gave her in her daily visits. And it's that real contrast of Mrs. Gibson, who's always like clutching at her own comfort, whereas Molly, who has got to the point in this story where she's able to not think about it at all and to pour herself out in service.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think one of the like nice little threads in the novel is how, in a very subtle way, Gaskell makes Molly a kind of knight errant, which is all the more interesting because there's another character we're coming to later called Osborne Hamley, who, when Molly first hears about him, she sort of pictures him as a knight in shining armour, and his reality is not a bad person, but definitely, again, someone who struggles with inaction and an inability to put into action the things that he wants to. Whereas Molly she's just charging around the place. Like, there's even a chapter called Molly Gibson to the rescue.
Yeah, there's a lot of excellent chapter titles, and particularly most of the ones that begin with Molly Gibson. Molly Gibson breathes freely. Molly Gibson to the rescue. Molly Gibson finds a champion. Gaskell does not hold back in her chapter titles.
Because a lot of the novel's action is based around the fact that Molly is becoming a young woman, and so her father suddenly feels that she needs a chaperone and that she needs to be kind of shielded from the world, and then selects this stepmother who seems to go out of her way to put her in exactly the trouble that her father's trying to save her from, but that also that she doesn't need that kind of shielding, not because like she deserves to be looked after, as we saw that like she allows herself at one point to be kind of neglected, which is seen as very much to everyone's kind of disgrace, but that because she has her own moral compass that she can really stand on, that it allows her to, I have a quote here that says she flies in the face of convention, that she speaks her mind, and she rides in haste to Hamley Hall, and she confronts a particular nefarious influence on her and her family, and that she kind of stood frightened yet brave, not letting go of her hold on what she meant to do, even when things seemed most against her, that she actually plays this chivalric gentleman on behalf of actually other women in the story. And so she really is this kind of interesting swashbuckling figure almost, in a very non-sensational way.
And I think it's important that Gaskell doesn't have this be something that comes to Molly naturally. From the beginning of the novel, which begins when Molly is a child and quickly speeds up to when she's becoming a young woman, Molly speaks her mind occasionally, but is not prone to running out and acting on behalf of other people. And it is when she has someone speak into her life as a positive role model in this regard and point her to thinking of others first, that we see this change begin to grow in her. And it's not an easy change either. She really isn't enjoying it, and says a few things about it, that life lived thinking of other people will be like she has died. And we see this incredible change and this life of action that transforms the lives of those around her, and really she's an agent of help and care for so many people in putting others first.
Yeah. That's such a great quote. I might actually read it out.
Yes.
Thinking more of others' happiness than her own was very fine, but did it not mean giving up her very individuality, quenching all the warm love, the true desires that made her herself? Yet in this deadness lay her only comfort, or so it seemed. It will be very dull when I shall have killed myself, as it were, and live only in trying to do, and to be, as other people like. I don't see any end to it. I might as well never have lived. And for the happiness you speak of, I shall never be happy again.
And in grounding this in an everyday story, I do love what comes directly after that, where she's told that this is a foolish sentiment, and she says, I dare say it seems foolish. Perhaps all our earthly trials will appear foolish to us after a while. Perhaps they seem so now to angels. But we are ourselves, you know, and this is now, not some time to come, a long, long way off. And we are not angels, to be comforted by seeing the ends for which everything is sent.
Yeah. I love how we actually see the inverse of this happening in the book, that her pursuit of virtue enables her to be freely herself when others who haven't pursued virtue in the same way can't be.
Yeah, that actually, as much as it seems in that moment that she's giving up who she is, she finds that the true virtue lies in being more herself, whereas everyone else is covering themselves with artifice. And it's something you mentioned already, Jacob, that straight talkingness, which is seen as a flaw, and is kind of a flaw to a certain extent. You know, she is part of polite society. She has to learn how to speak in ways that aren't upsetting or affronting to people. But I do think in some ways it is also both a failing and a virtue, because there is such a virtue shown in actually saying what you think, rather than Mrs. Gibson's approach, which is, I believe there's a quote that says, you know, she so rarely said what she actually thought, so why would this thing that she's hearing actually be the truth anyway?
She knew that he had forbidden her to try for this end as distinctly as words could express a meaning, but her own words so seldom expressed her meaning, or if they did, she held to her opinions so loosely that she had no idea but that it was the same with other people.
It's even worse than we remembered. And there's another time where she's in polite conversation and talking to someone about a play. And it says that Osborne had the advantage over Mrs. Gibson, who in fact only spoke of these things from hearsay, from listening to the talk at the Towers. But she, Mrs. Gibson, had the advantage over him in greater boldness of invention to eke out her facts. And besides, she had more skill in the choice and arrangement of her words, so as to make it appear as if the opinions that were in reality quotations were formed by herself from actual experience or personal observation. And it's this manner of conversing where she's able to make it seem like she's been to all these plays and is living in this much higher society just out of pride's sake.
Yeah.
Whereas Molly is very direct and sometimes puts herself and others to blush with coming out with something a little bit too honest, but is loved for that as well.
That directness that is so refreshing in a kind of a community of people who are constantly obfuscating their motives and their desires and saying things that they don't really mean. And it kind of reminds me as well, the other point that I had, that there's a sort of contrast between Molly and Mrs. Gibson, and maybe this is one that we can spend a little bit of time on and enjoy some of the delicious quotes around, which is that Molly, especially at one point, really gets into trouble because she has favoured doing what was actually right over what makes her look good, and in fact kind of puts her in the bad books of her community and her village. And she does that because she knows it is more important to do the right thing. And even more complicated than that, she's keeping a secret which she feels she begs not to have to keep a secret because she doesn't think it is the right thing to keep this as a secret. So she doesn't really agree with this being a secret, but she has been sworn to secrecy. And so she keeps that promise. And so she's put even further in a situation where she is made to look worse than she is. And in fact, she's not bad at all. She's doing the right thing, but she is made to look bad by both acting correctly and also keeping a secret which she doesn't even agree with in the first place, but on principle she keeps. This couldn't be more different for Mrs. Gibson. Mrs. Gibson is the absolute queen of doing something that is hurtful and wrong, but that will make her look like she's virtuous. It is I just, every time, and it comes up over and over again in the novel, and it just baffled me every single time.
It's so painful. And that there's a description of her near the start which says, she was not what would commonly be called a woman of determination, but somehow what she disliked she avoided, and what she liked she tried to do or to have. And that really just keeps playing in as she just prioritizes making herself look good. And there's this awful scene when she's first married to Mr. Gibson and her daughter is in school in France and coming back, and she's talking about redoing the room for her. And because of this, she insists on redoing Molly's room as well, even though Molly doesn't want to have hers redone.
And Molly has very specific reasons for not wanting her room redone. Mm-hmm. All the furniture in it was her mother's, and she has sentimental attachment to it. And she has expressed this previously to many people, and Mrs. Gibson cannot see beyond the end of her own interests.
Mrs. Gibson is in fact horrified by Molly objecting to this redoing of her room, because Molly's saying, why can't you just not tell people? And she's like, but that makes me look bad.
Yes, she's saying that, Molly kind of suggests, well, couldn't you just redo Cynthia's and leave mine? But we don't have to tell anyone. Like, who's going to be in my room? We'll just keep that private.
Yeah. Her response, in such a tittle-tattle place as Hollingford, really, Molly, you are either very stupid or very obstinate, or else you don't care what hard things may be said about me, and all for a selfish fancy of your own. No, I owe myself the justice of acting in this matter as I please. Everyone shall know that I'm not a common stepmother. Every penny I spend on Cynthia I shall spend on you too, so it's no use talking about it any more. So Molly's little white dimity bed, her old-fashioned chest of drawers, and her other cherished relics of her mother's maiden days were consigned to the lumber room.
Gaskell describes Mrs. Gibson as an unperceptive person, except when her own interests are dependent on another person's humour. And that is borne out time and time again about the only time she will notice anyone else's cares or emotions is if her own have a stake in the other person's. And even then, it's not always, not every time.
Yeah, it's so damning because it is the ultimate prioritization. And we're going to come to her daughter Cynthia in a moment, but Cynthia has this as well, which is this like high prioritization on how others perceive you and how you are coming across to other people, much far and above actually doing the right thing. And I think that whole section is so moving because even Molly is very reticent to point out that her furniture is her mother's because she feels like it's a low blow to say to her stepmother, and that surely the second she says it, she'll get her way, and she doesn't want to use that kind of emotional blunt force to get what she wants. And Mrs. Gibson breezes right past that and says that this is a selfish fancy of her own. It's just heartbreaking.
At one point when Molly is trying to go to the sickbed of a dear friend, Mrs. Gibson forbids it so that she will have company that evening, and then offers that Molly, when she goes to the sickbed the next day, can have her shawl and ribbons, as if that will comfort her. because it would comfort Mrs. Gibson herself. And to her mind, she's being very kind and generous because she's thinking about her own desires and pleasures.
And also, it's so damning that the reason she objects initially, because the father's given the consent for her to go, is that she wasn't asked.
Yes.
And she's like protecting her rights as the mother.
Yeah, she thinks that in objecting, she comes across as looking concerned for Molly's well-being, and that she doesn't want to go to a social engagement without Molly because it will look like she doesn't care about bringing Molly. There's even a really horrific moment when Molly is preparing for a moment of grief and is briefly home because Mrs. Gibson keeps summoning her home so that she doesn't look like she doesn't care about Molly. And Mrs. Gibson insists, I don't think it works out, but she's insisting that Molly go to a dance. And, can you imagine anything more contrary to how you're feeling if you are grieving and preparing for grief, that to go to a ball and dress up and be nice and friendly to people?
And what's even worse, really, is that when we do see her in company with Molly or at events with Molly, she often talks down to Molly and throws Molly under the bus for various reasons because, again, she sees as far as her own desires go and no further. So if it suits her in conversation, she will be focusing solely on how people are receiving her and her alone, and will throw Molly to the wolves.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's not like she's any better to her own daughter.
That was what I was going to say, which is that I think that's so interesting when you think of her familial relations. And I also think it's interesting that she's not an evil character. On some level, she can just about grasp the good, and she is better when surrounded by better people. And this is very much signposted near the start of the book when she is getting engaged to Mr. Gibson, and she is hoping for a speedy marriage so she doesn't have to go back to work, and she's having her desires in that realm thwarted. In fact, just as an aside, there's one little bit that I really love where she even imagines a little speech for Mr. Gibson to give her that to convince her to give up her post, where it says she hoped Mr. Gibson's ardor would be such that he would press on the marriage and urge her never to resume her school drudgery, but to relinquish it now and forever. She even made up a very pretty, very passionate speech for him in her own mind, quite sufficiently strong to prevail upon her and overthrow the scruples which she felt she ought to have.
We're given very few windows into her genuine feelings and her genuine emotions, and more often we're given a window to the genuine lack thereof.
Yes.
One of the very few times is in conversation with her daughter. The idea that she might not feel the death of her daughter is raised, and that she might sort of be thinking about the future if her daughter died and planning accordingly. I should think myself wanting in strength of mind if I could not look forward to the consequences of death. I really think we're commanded to do so, somewhere in the Bible or the prayer book. Do you look forward to the consequences of my death, Mamma? Asked Cynthia. You really are the most unfeeling girl I ever met with, said Mrs. Gibson. And Gaskell does note that in that instance she is really hurt. But that's kind of the bare level that we're given with her.
She's so surface level.
She's got a lot of vapid little aphorisms, and I love them all, including, I consider the thought as everything, said Mrs. Gibson. Thought is spiritual, while action is merely material. And the future is hidden from us by infinite wisdom, Molly, or else I should like to know it. One would calculate one's behaviour so much better at the present time if one knew what events were to come.
That says so much about how she manipulates people. That calculating effect going forward.
100%. She's also credited with having a superficial skill in the choice and arrangement of her words. And it is superficial entirely.
Yeah, she is just the queen of all of those. She's so smug and self-satisfied. And so when she's getting engaged and she's planning her wedding, she has this really interesting and honestly at that point to me quite shocking moment where we've mentioned Cynthia is abroad in France in school, and everyone is obviously arranging the wedding with the expectation that Cynthia will come home and be a bridesmaid along with Molly. And at the time, Mrs. Kirkpatrick, she's a widow already at that point. That's why she has a daughter, obviously. But Mrs. Kirkpatrick, to be Mrs. Gibson, doesn't want her daughter to come to her wedding because she didn't want somebody more beautiful than her at her wedding. And nobody can kind of get to the bottom of why she's throwing up obstacles for her daughter coming. And one of the ones is money. And as you've heard, she has a real thing with working. She has a real value on money and knows its worth because she's had to work for it, especially when she didn't want to. But at one point, Mr. Gibson gives her the money to bring Cynthia home for the wedding and gives this kind of encouragement to her. And the novel says, at that time, Mrs. Kirkpatrick felt as if they would bring her home for the wedding and caught the reflection of his strong wish and fancied it was her own. If the letter could have been written and the money sent off that day while the reflected glow of affection lasted, Cynthia would have been a bridesmaid to her mother. But 100 little interruptions came in the way of letter writing, and the next day maternal love had diminished and the value affixed to the money had increased.
I think it's another place where the everyday story comes into it is Gaskell often highlights these little could have beens, would have beens, should have beens, where there was a path to a better outcome and it was dodged quite effectively.
Yeah. And it really goes to show the effects of that neglect of the duty of love. And we're going to come to Cynthia, I think, just very, very soon. But I think Jacob, maybe you can find one more quote for me, which is her quote about her QC relative.
Yes, I do have that here. This is a relative who has reappeared in a much greater station than he had been the last time that they had met. Mrs. Gibson was in a flutter of sentimental delight, which she fancied was family affection, but which might not have been quite so effervescent if Mr. Kirkpatrick had remained in his former position of struggling lawyer with 7 children living in Doughty Street.
As we've said, everything is absolutely just to the extent at which she is interested and benefits her and her comfort. And I think we're going to have to, we're already a good chunk into this episode. We wanted to talk about Mr. Gibson, but I think we're going to skip straight through Cynthia and Lady Harriet.
Before we do that, I was going to pull up one quote of Molly's to counterbalance all of Mrs. Gibson's
entirely fair.
Subtle nastiness. This is from when we were talking about her facing the stigma of her community, and she's had a conversation with her father about it and chosen to kind of just go through with her head held high and not try and counteract anything. For all of Molly's bravery at the time of this conversation, it was she that suffered more than her father. He kept out of the way of hearing gossip, but she was perpetually thrown into the small society of the place. Molly herself was invited, but there was a tacit and underhand protest against her being received on the old terms. Everyone was civil to her, but no one was cordial. There was a very perceptible film of difference in their behaviour to her from what it was formerly. Nothing that had outlines and could be defined. But Molly, for all her clear conscience and her brave heart, felt acutely that she was only tolerated, not welcome. She never told her father how she felt these perpetual small slights. She had chosen to bear the burden of her own free will. Nay, more, she had insisted on being allowed to do so, and it was not for her to grieve him now by showing that she shrank from the consequences of her own act. So she never even made an excuse for not going into the small gaieties.
What a contrast that is.
It's such a powerful move of just continuing to do the right thing and not letting herself, even off the hook of making some very justifiable excuses of, oh, everybody's being mean to me, I won't go.
Yeah, do I really need to go to this evening of card games or whatever it is? Like,
I have a headache.
Yeah. It would be so easy to get out of. It would be so easy to avoid. And she doesn't even take those opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
But to move from Molly to her stepsister, Cynthia, who, and again, that's such a wonderful contrast. And I actually really love a lot of the interactions that they have. They're two quite different people. Cynthia is this kind of glamorous, attractive, effervescent, very engaging person, and quite, in some ways, morally deficient. Not that she does terrible things, but she recognizes like her own failings in terms of cultivating virtue. But the difference between Cynthia and her mother is that Cynthia really recognizes and values Molly's worth and sees the ways in which she is lacking compared to herself. And as much as those two are a foil, I also just want to throw in a little extra foil. There's a character who's not a very big character, but I've given her like a chunk in here just because I think she's the coolest character. She's so great. I love everything that's to do with her. Her name's Lady Harriet. She is the daughter of the most prestigious family in the neighborhood. I think she's the eldest daughter.
I think she's the youngest, but she's 28.
Yes.
She's older than everyone else.
Her mother is panicking about her age and her lack of suitors.
That's right.
Or her turning down of suitors. Yes.
But she also has this quite engaging and assertive character. And she also really recognizes Molly's worth. Where Cynthia looks at Molly and sees the value, and in some ways, again, to a much greater extent than Mrs Gibson, is emboldened and ennobled by the people around her being better. Like she herself acts better when the people around her are acting well. But Lady Harriet takes it so much more firmly than that and actually modifies her actions, goes out of her way to do good, follows through on Molly's wishes, and essentially at one point then rides to Molly's rescue in terms of her reputation. And it is just one of the most satisfying parts of the book.
Yeah, there's a beautiful moment where like Lady Harriet's got this 17-year-old girl with her who's outspokenly reprimanding her for being dismissive of a couple of ladies in the village.
Yeah, these kind of wittering old ladies who we love, who are amazing, but are definitely, Lady Harriet is the sort of glamorous upper echelons, and they are very much the kind of lower,
lowest middle class.
Lowest middle class.
But Lady Harriet takes that reprimand and accepts it. And changes her behaviour. Yeah. And continues to change her behaviour towards the people of the village because of that. Yeah. And it's such a humbling moment as well, because she's taking it from somebody so much younger than her that's like her protege. But yeah, it says a lot about who she is.
Can we read that? Because it's a really great scene.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lady Harriet uses these unbecoming nicknames for these ladies, and Molly says, "No, don't visit, please. You must not come. Indeed, you must not." "Why not?" "Because I would rather not. Because I think that I ought not to have anyone coming to see me who laughs at the friends I am staying with and calls them names." Molly's heart beat very fast, but she meant every word that she said. "My dear little woman," said Lady Harriet, bending over her and speaking quite gravely, "I'm very sorry to have called them names. Very, very sorry to have hurt you. If I promise you to be respectful to them in word and in deed, and in very thought if I can, you'll let me then, won't you?"
It's so great. And Harriet then does go on to visit, and even visits when Molly isn't there, and is kind and generous to these people. And it's so gratifying to see someone, like you said, who has no sort of obligation to Molly and could just sniff it off and be like, well, I'm her better anyway. I'm her social superior. But instead genuinely takes that reprimand seriously and to heart. Whereas Cynthia, who is I have a lot of compassion for Cynthia. I really love how much she does kind of yearn for the good, but there is a real lack in her ability to execute it. And I think it's very telling that there's this key moment where she's talking about her own moral state, where it says, Cynthia was quite silent. At length she said, I wish I was good. So do I, said Molly simply. At least if you're not good, what am I? I am not good, and I shall never be now. Perhaps I might be a heroine still, but I shall never be a good woman, I know. You think it is easier to be a heroine? Yes, as far as one knows of heroines from history, I am capable of a great jerk, an effort, then a relaxation. But steady, everyday goodness is beyond me. I must be a moral kangaroo. I am not good, and I have told you so. Somehow, then she's talking about her mother, and this is what I kind of mentioned earlier about the neglect. Somehow I cannot forgive her for her neglect of me as a child when I would have clung to her. Which is so damning and so sad. But I think that idea of the moral kangaroo is really interesting, because there are certain points where Cynthia really actually exerts her virtue and comes to Molly in difficult circumstances and does better than she has done previously. But there are other moments when she fails, and she fails to change herself or live up to her better standards, or most tellingly, pushes people away from her when she feels like they are expecting more of her, or that she has degraded herself in some even small way in their eyes, that she just can't bear to have someone think even momentarily bad of her. And I think it's a misguidedness in this idea of like, I can be a moral kangaroo, that like actually what Gaskell is saying is that real virtue comes from choosing it every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that she can't face the love of those who, if they don't think well of her as well. That even though Molly loves her, once Molly knows her secret, and she therefore thinks Molly is thinking badly of her and withdraws from her.
Yeah.
And I think it's a shame almost that that Molly has committed to living virtuously before she meets Cynthia, in that Cynthia is confronted, in her own estimation, she's confronted by Dr. Gibson and by Molly. She says, I've never lived with people with such a high standard of conduct before, and I don't quite know how to behave. And she is holding herself up in estimation to them and not really seeing them fail. And perhaps there could have been a different world where she saw a pettier Molly learn to be different and been inspired. But as we have it, she's too scared to make that leap to commit to a life of virtue.
Yeah, she feels like that boat has already passed, and she's not seeing that, as we've said, that this moral choice is something that comes every day. It's not a question of having missed out on the opportunity for it, and that there are failures, because I think I said we were going to skip Mr. Gibson. I'm going to come back to Mr. Gibson. I'm going back on my own word. He is a man of very high principle, and we do see that in the novel, and he's very interesting, but he does fail in some key ways, particularly in the choice of his, as we've mentioned, awful second wife. But that, again, because he holds himself to a very, very high standard, he just assumes that other people do as well. It's just the same as Mrs. Gibson not holding other people to, like, having people have the low standards that she has, that they have this kind of, he's expecting more and she's expecting less, and that's what kind of comes to a crux of it. And it says of him, he made up his mind before his marriage to yield in trifles and be firm in greater things. But the differences of opinion about trifles arose every day, and were perhaps more annoying than if they had been related to things of more consequence. Molly knew her father's looks as well as she knew her alphabet. His wife did not, and being, as Jacob has already pointed out, an unperceptive person, except when her own interests were dependent upon another person's humour, never found out how he was worried by all the small daily concessions which he made to her will or her whims. He never allowed himself to put any regret into shape, even in his own mind. He repeatedly reminded himself of his wife's good qualities and comforted himself by thinking they should work together better as time rolled on.
And that willingly blinding himself to it and like shutting himself down from it means that he never calls her to be better. And then the same with Cynthia, that he's never seeing that they're not attaining the same moral standard and helping them to rise above it. He's just not seeing it until he sees it and is horrified.
And it's too late. And in fact, there's a particular moment where Mrs. Gibson does something very egregious, and it is kind of a moment of revelation for Mr. Gibson, where he says, "Well, I suppose as one brews, one must bake." "I don't understand what you mean," pouted she. "Perhaps not," he replied. "I suppose that is what you heard on that occasion that made you change your behaviour." "Well, don't be angry, dear. Do you know I was quite afraid you were going to lose your temper at one time." "It would have been of no use," said he gloomily, getting up as if to close the sitting. His wife was only too glad to make her escape. The conjugal interview had not been satisfactory to either. Mr. Gibson had been compelled to face and acknowledge the fact that the wife he had chosen had a very different standard of conduct from that which he had upheld all his life, and had hoped to have seen inculcated in his daughter. He was more irritated than he chose to show, for there was so much self-reproach in his irritation that he kept it to himself, brooded over it, and allowed a feeling of suspicious dissatisfaction with his wife to grow up in his mind.
I think people's levels of awareness are really interesting. And I mentioned at the start that we have characters that we're sympathetic to who make mistakes, and characters that we're unsympathetic to. And Mrs. Gibson, I don't kid myself that I have any sympathy for her. And she's so totally unaware of her own motivations, let alone anyone else's. And we see Mr. Gibson be willfully blind for a long time to other people. Cynthia is very interesting because she's keenly aware of herself and the people around her, but that awareness and that perception is not enough, that she needs to take the step of engaging with that knowledge and, choosing the better part.
Like, in a very interesting way, she's the only one who has enough cunning and subtlety herself to see her mother's manipulations and call her out on them, or like try and fight against them.
And funnily enough, she makes a prophecy near the end, which does come true, and is the last thing anyone who hears it wants to hear at the time. But she is that keenly perceptive about people and does accurately predict certain things that are going to happen, even though she can't put herself on a path towards goodness, towards
that in that way knowledge is not enough. And even knowledge of the good is not enough, that it has to be followed up with action on some level. It's so heartbreaking. I really like Cynthia, and it's very hard to see her fail in what could be a much better story for her.
Yeah. Not that she's a particularly traumatic.
No, and I think, again, this is an everyday story, that there are not sweeping gothic revenges or comeuppances. It's just, but
she doesn't catch consumption and die.
Right. But at the same time, it is potentially the loss of the eternal life of a soul. You know, that the stakes for her are the same as the stakes for someone in a big sweeping epic battle with a preternatural creature. That those stakes are exactly the same, and her failure in a small way to live up to the standards which she ought to be will, as we've said, potentially lead her to damnation just as sure as anything else.
And we feel that sorrow and that weight as Molly has such hope for her relationship with Cynthia, and as it becomes clear that Cynthia will withdraw, Molly feels that pain, and we feel the weight of it. And with that lack of perception of Mrs. Gibson versus the perception of Cynthia, there's a very pivotal moment where Molly is rushing to do good and hears the call and is going immediately out into the night. And "Why, what in the world?" said Mrs. Gibson. "Molly, what are you thinking about?" But Cynthia had understood it at a glance and was arranging Molly's hastily assumed dress as she passed along. And even in those moments that Cynthia understands and is very good to Molly, often in small domestic ways, and is close to her, and they have the potential for a beautiful sisterly relationship. And that makes it all the more sad.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Cynthia's fascinating. It just, again, as you said, that knowledge is not enough. And she really reminds me of a poem by Robert Crawford called Advice, which goes, "When you are faced with two alternatives, choose both. And should they put you to the test, tick every box. Nothing is ever single. A seed's, a tree's, a ship's, a constellation. Nail your true colours to this branching mast." And I think there's a positive reading of that poem, and I think there's a negative one, and the negative one really reminds me of Cynthia, that she can't really decide on her true colours, and she will fix them to every flagpole.
And I think the saddest thing for me is in her story is to see the ways in which she withdraws from the people who convict her to be better and gravitates to people who allow her. It's that dichotomy between Molly and Mrs Gibson. Is it comfort or is it virtue?
Is it challenge or is it acceptance and ardour?
Yeah. And I think maybe that brings us to our last section, which I said might include some spoilers. So if your interest has been strongly piqued at this point, maybe you might want to leave it here, but I think we're still going to avoid some of the kind of major plot points, but there will be some kind of giving away of some of the story in this next section, because we're going to turn to the Squire and the Hamley family.
And the main spoiler that we're giving away is about halfway through the book, maybe a third of the way. So it's not like one of the ones that comes at the end.
Right. But while Mr. Gibson is off finding his suitable or unsuitable second wife, he places Molly in the care of a family, specifically with a relatively invalided mother, Mrs. Hamley, and the two of them dote on each other, and it's a really beautiful relationship. But like I said, in some ways it's not really a spoiler. Mrs. Hamley is very much obviously kind of declining throughout the book. While Molly is staying with that family, there is the Squire and there is his wife, but there is also she hears secondhand about the two sons, Osborne and Roger. And at the start, very much Osborne is cast as the hero. He's the eldest born. He's going to do great things at university. He's going to solve all of their problems. And Roger is kind of an awkward stick in the mud. He's not very handsome. He's a bit boring. And then as the novel progresses, you kind of meet these two people in reality and see a very different version of them. And specifically, Osborne falls from grace in his father's eyes, is reckless with his money, and is actually accused of something which is not true. He is accused of having sort of scouted out information on the likelihood of his father's death and the kind of life insurance he could get, and the idea that he is sort of, again, we mentioned about Mrs. Gibson, what are the consequences of my daughter's death, speculating and potentially profiting on the idea of his father's death. And this isn't actually true. It comes from him being truly reckless with money, but it's other people who are trying to find out this information about him, not him. But the Squire hears this and feels incredibly hurt, obviously, but they have a real failure to communicate and to reconcile with each other. And this very much comes to a head when, as you might have guessed, Mrs. Hamley passes away, and the two men are kind of stuck in the house with each other. And as Jacob, you mentioned, there's throughout the novel these moments where there is an opportunity for things to go better than it does, and people miss that opportunity. And I think it's such a real lesson in realizing the finitude of life, that there is actually a finite number of chances that you can miss all of them if you're not careful. And I think the moment that Osborne comes home to his mother's deathbed is so telling. It says, "Osborne did not stand up when his father entered. He was too much exhausted, too much oppressed by his feelings, and also too much estranged by his father's angry, suspicious letters. If he had come forward with any manifestation of feeling at this moment, everything might have been different, but he waited for his father to see him before he uttered a word. All that the Squire said when his eye fell upon him at last was, 'You are here, sir.'"
It's so sad. There's like these repetitions of moments where they could have brought a moment of reconciliation between them. And the father's just like quite harsh and rough in his words. And it will at least say that his like bark is worse than his bite. But it is really telling on what the effects of harsh words can have on somebody of a more sensitive temperament. And like that necessity to actually manage your words, and that's part of a virtue that you're called to.
Which is kind of interesting given what we said about there being a virtue in Molly's directness.
Yeah.
I think this is an example of a time when knowledge would have been enough.
Yeah.
And at no point does the knowledge come out to fix things. And it's heartbreaking. You have the squire turning round and saying, he might try not to show it so plain to me as he does. I'm getting case hardened, but it does cut me to the quick sometimes. It does. And he so fond of his dad as he was once. If I can but get the land drained, I'll make him an allowance and let him go to London or where he likes. Maybe he'll do better this time, or maybe he'll go to the dogs altogether, but perhaps it will make him think a bit kindly of the old father at home. I should like him to do that. I should.
Yeah, and there's that real yearning in the squire to be better than he is. And I think, again, that's another really great example. So with Cynthia, you have this sort of general knowledge of not living up to a higher standard and kind of yearning but not really acting on it. The squire is different, and I think the squire is something that I, at least for myself, I can absolutely see in my, like, in the frustrations of my own kind of experience of the moral life, which is the moments when you catch yourself doing the thing that you absolutely don't want to do, you know is hurting everyone around you, and yet you cannot keep from doing it. And he is in this like very painful situation where everything seems to be going against him at once. And again, as I keep coming back to, it's the question of this everyday virtue that on some level he's been allowed to be kind of cantankerous all of his life. And then the one anchoring thing that he had, his wife, again, being better by the people you're surrounded by, when that's taken away, he doesn't have that foundation. And so this is, it's a slightly long quote, but it's one of my favorites because I just think it's so, it kind of cuts me to the quick, where it says, to careless observers, for instance, it would seem as though the squire was rendered more capricious and exacting, more passionate and authoritative by his wife's death. The truth was that it occurred at a time when many things came to harass him, and some to bitterly disappoint him, and she was no longer there, to whom he used to carry his sore heart for the gentle balm of her sweet words. So the sore heart ached and smarted intensely and often. When he saw how his violent conduct affected others, he could have cried out for their pity instead of their anger and resentment. Have mercy upon me, for I am very miserable. How often have such dumb thoughts gone up for the hearts of those who have taken hold of their sorrow by the wrong end, as prayers against sin. And when the squire saw that his servants were learning to dread him, and his firstborn to avoid him, he did not blame them. He knew he was becoming a domestic tyrant. It seemed as if all circumstances conspired against him, and as if he was too weak to struggle with them. Else, why did everything indoors and out of doors go so wrong just now, when all he could have done, had things been prosperous, was to have submitted in very imperfect patience to the loss of his wife?
It's brutal. It's interesting, you do see him be very aware of these recurring issues, of his recurring anger, of his recurring outbursts, and often he will try to be better. A few days later, maybe after repeatedly tongue lashing someone, he will turn around and try to improve. And there is at least the knowledge and the desire there. But often the failure and often the weakness. At one point, after denying something several times, he has to turn around to his son and tell him that he should do the thing and that he should take the invitation. And he says, "Why did you take me up so sharp, Roger? You all take me up so hastily nowadays. I think it's hard when a man mustn't be allowed a bit of crossness when he's tired and heavy at heart. That I do."
I wish we had time to talk about Roger. Roger is such a great, like, male good moral character.
Fun fact, Elizabeth Gaskell was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and Roger Hamley is based on Charles Darwin.
So interesting.
That's funny.
And I think one of the things that's nice about Roger that we can say, at least in a short amount of time, is that as has been kind of suggested, he and Osborne have very different temperaments, and there is good and bad in both, although I think Roger very much leans on the good side rather than the bad, but there's certainly good in Osborne as well, but they are very different and they truly love each other. Like, they are an example. We've talked a lot about the contrast and the foils and the ways that people kind of rub up against each other, but Roger and Osborne are really emblematic of the fact that differences in temperament don't actually have to manifest as differences in love between each other. They are just great brothers who really love each other.
They're utterly different, and it's something I often say about this book is that in the hands of a lesser author, the brothers would not get along. They're kind of almost stereotypical or archetypal in the way they take after opposite parents, and they're set up to be rivals and to bash against each other, and instead they are so devoted and loyal and just one of the best fraternal relationships I've ever read.
And one of Mrs. Gibson's most foolish moments is when she starts trying to pit them against each other, even to each other, and you're just like, this is such a bad tact.
Fail.
Yeah.
And it's Roger who, we were saying that Molly gets some very good advice near the start, and it is Roger who gives her that, and who, like, reaches out to her in compassion at the start of it.
I think we see Gaskell's Unitarian background when she says that every young girl who has a young man kind of giving advice sets him up as a pope.
Yes. It's sadly not a Catholic novel, although there are some very interesting Catholic elements in it, for any of our listeners who are curious to actually get some surprisingly nuanced takes on Catholics in this novel.
And I think Roger and Osborne are also very interesting in that Roger is so constant and true and a good friend, a good man, and someone who is, by all the perceptive characters, perceived as such, and honoured and respected by them as such. And Osborne is far weaker than his brother, and yet still they love and respect each other and care for each other in every way that they can. Osborne is more similar to Cynthia, and when we were talking about Cynthia not being able to make that leap, Osborne also sees that leap ahead of him. It says he saw no way out of it at all, excepting by the one strong stroke of which he felt himself incapable.
Yeah. And there's another quote that says he's too indolent to keep an unassisted conscience.
That's so harsh.
Yeah.
There's also some very funny moments. I mentioned about him not being very good at working. There's a moment where he desperately needs to make some money, and the only thing he can think of is to come up with is to write some poems, which he does so in, like, the most haphazard and unlike commercial way possible.
And then to try and get them published and be surprised that that's not going to get any money.
To be fair, I do think he might have also pitched going to Australia.
Renowned for making money.
Yeah. And, there's, although this is, again, a slightly heartbreaking moment where he sort of has an interaction with his father and is irritated and is like, why don't you just, like, give me that money and I'll go away and I won't be a problem to you anymore. And the squire very much says, there was a son who said that before.
Oh.
Give me my portion now.
Squire is so blinded by his own hurt at the imagined wrong that he can't see past it to try and help his son in, like, easing his pain and finding out what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And I think it's heartbreaking in the glimpses. You see how much he loves him, and they're very different people. But the Squire deeply loves Osborne and is ready to put up with every little fuss that he has, and every little liking he has for particular things. And it says, that Osborne's likes and dislikes had been the rule of the house for a long time.
Yeah.
And his father wants nothing but to do that. But with this great hurdle between them of this lack of communication, they can't express that love, they can't share that love, and they both kind of stare at this hurdle, and one could do something about it. And
yeah, you're kind of urging them and wishing them to do it. And I think it's interesting how in that situation where previously, like you said, Osborne's kind of fancies and whims were the rule of the house, but they were also quite emblematic of his mother as well. And so after his mother's death, between the sort of frustrations with Osborne and then the reminding of his now deceased wife, these things become this source of irritation to the Squire. And you can totally see it. There's just this moment where he's been out in the fields working all day, and he comes in to have dinner and nobody seems to be ready, and the servants are taking their time because Osborne isn't ready, and normally they wait around for Osborne. And Osborne comes down in his little foppish outfit with his all of his regalia, because that's how his mother liked him to be, and he feels like he's honoring his mother by continuing that tradition. And
they're dressing for dinner,
right? And his father is there like, I've been working all day and I'm waiting for dinner because you were doing your cufflinks.
And when Osborne is giving his reasons, which are genuine, they can't be heard except as an attack on the Squire. Oh, my mother liked it. Oh, do you think I don't know what she liked? Do you think I want to disrespect her memory?
Yeah. And it's so interesting to me. I think it's very perceptive in the ways that especially those kind of family relationships break down when you're so close that you can end up being kind of far away. That the little traditions of your family life, or the little kind of nuances or the ways that you interact, can just get out of place, and it can be so hard to get them back on track, which is again why it takes that cultivation of everyday virtue to listen, to understand, to be patient, to be compassionate, that these day-to-day virtues are the ones that actually overcome these bigger calamities. So, I mean, Jacob, do you think we have sufficiently covered Wives and Daughters for your liking, or do we need to do another 5-part episode?
I would like to have another vapid aphorism before we finish.
Absolutely. Let's close this out with, I'm going to guess, one of Mrs Gibson's vapid aphorisms.
How did you guess? Mrs Gibson is wondering where some of her daughter's money may have gone. But then she must have got the money somewhere. It always has struck me that if you have not extravagant habits, and do not live up to your income, you must have a certain sum to lay by at the end of the year. Have I not often said so, Mr Gibson?
It's just totally useless information and advice. She just preens herself with her little insightful aphorisms, as you said. So I really hope that this will inspire at least some of our listeners to read the book. I thought it was really great. If you're worried about the ending and it not ending, perhaps we should close our ending with that.
So I always say, and I said at the beginning, that I think it's a selling point. I think it, in an odd poetic way, leans into our subtitle and our theme for today, an everyday story. Gaskell wrote 60 chapters of this book. It is a long book. And I feel, I think Phoebe and I disagree, that it could very easily have ended with chapter 61. We were very close. All the strings have been tied up. We know where it was going. It can be shocking if you don't know that the book is unfinished, but when you do, it's almost as if you've departed the town of Hollingford. You don't get to see the end of this story, because that's life. We don't always get a perfectly tied up bow at the end. And I just have learned to love this aspect of the story more and more over time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it does make it really quite interesting in its unfinished And this time rereading it, I definitely could take that a lot better, particularly because Rachel has a great point about it.
Well, my point about my very least favourite part of North and South is that I loved that book right up until I think it's pretty much the last sentence,
the last paragraph.
She makes some sort of, like, it's all very romantic, and then she makes this incredibly clunky joke right at the end, and it really spoiled it for me. I was like, oh, it was like somebody like doing a wah 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 on the trombone right at the end of the book. I have no idea why it ends that way. And so my point in the editions of Wives and Daughters, there tends to be a little editor's note at the end which sort of, talks about the fact that it's not finished. And the editor says, we know she would have finished it off beautifully. I contend that we don't know that, and we don't actually have a clean record for her for ending things perfectly. So I say that maybe the ending, we were saved from another sort of weird comedy moment at the very end, and that maybe we're all better off for a slightly unfinished novel.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. I think also for me, because I'd gone straight into this book from reading North and South, which has quite a lot of twists and turns in the last third, I guess. Where you think it's coming to an ending, and then you've got a whole chunk of things, of people dying and things moving and quite dramatic things happening. So I think I got to the end of this book not knowing that it wasn't finished, and went, so how many people was she going to kill off? But yeah, there is something beautiful in not seeing how it gets to finish, but having an idea of how it would wrap up. And yeah, we are saved from any clunkiness that she may have brought in. So I don't hold it against it too hard.
Yeah.
And definitely going into it knowing that it's not finished, I think, is the main thing.
I would note that this is generally recognised by those who have read it as Gaskell's masterpiece novel. And so, yeah, just what I know, we gave some laudatory quotes at the beginning, but this one, she is at the height of her craft. She is using subtlety, and just you don't see all the clever techniques she's using to build this story. And she brings so much nuance and importance to tiny little domestic scenes, like a son sitting down and smoking a pipe with his father, or that same father putting out his pipe and reading the prayers for the servants. There's so much brought to bear in these little moments that build up the characters and build up the stakes, the spiritual and emotional stakes of the story.
Yeah, the little moments of domestic love and sacrifice.
Yes. And I really don't think the fact that it is unfinished should deter anyone from reading it. I don't, while it can be like a little bit of a moment of like, I just wish I knew, I don't think it's so much of a missing ending that you feel like you didn't get the story, or that it is like a hard cut in the middle of the height of the action.
It's certainly not an ending that leaves mysteries.
Right.
It's an ending that leaves perhaps some unfulfilled emotional beat for the reader, but no mysteries.
So I would really encourage people to read it. And I think that is it, and that will be it for this season of Risking Enchantment. We, of course, have our usual question, which is, Phoebe, Jacob, what have you been enjoying at the moment?
Well, I think we had a universal one to say first.
We did.
We have, and this is quite an unusual thing for me to be enjoying at the moment, but we have all been enjoying the newest Jenny Nicholson video.
If you're looking for very long format but frivolous nonsense, I would really recommend her videos.
She's an in-depth, investigative YouTuber. Jenny gives these wonderful deep dives into certain pop culture areas, particularly to do with theme parks and Star Wars and such like. And her latest 4-hour video is on the monumental failure of the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Star Wars Hotel, and it is a delight.
Yeah,
it's hilarious.
It's wonderful. It may be 4 hours long, but Phoebe and I are still working our way through it. Jacob has finished it. It's the type of thing that is just kind of fun to imbibe as maybe you're doing some other things. But like, honestly, she's so good at what she does, you could pay it its full attention. It feels insane to say that about a 4-hour YouTube video about a theme park hotel, but she's very, very funny. But that is our kind of frivolous, not quite joke, but lighthearted recommendation. And we have some more serious, ponderous, culturally astute recommendations as well.
We're so culturally astute.
Yeah, my more highbrow recommendation. Well, I don't know if it's a recommendation anymore because it's probably not running anymore. But while we were in Chicago, our friends very kindly organised to take us to a play of Murder in the Cathedral, which we have podcasted about.
In fact, Jacob here commented on that. That's the one about martyrdom that you sent me a message on.
Mm-hmm.
That's so funny.
Full circle.
That's beautiful. But yeah, it was a really beautiful play by quite a small production company, and they were just really faithful to the text and did a really beautiful job of it.
Yeah, I also really loved it, but we won't double up on the recommendations or the what we're enjoying at the moment. So I will say the other thing that we did on our trip, which is that we got to see Wildcat, the film directed by Ethan Hawke and starring his daughter Maya Hawke as Flannery O'Connor. It is kind of a biopic about Flannery O'Connor, but it interweaves with some of the narratives of her short stories where you get to kind of explore those as you're going through her life. It is wonderfully done. I am certain I will be doing an episode on it as soon as possible. It was great. We got to go to a screening which also had a Q&A with Ethan Hawke at the end, and we were attending with friends of ours. It was such a wonderful night.
Yeah, it was really beautiful.
I had such a great experience, and it was a great movie. So I'm really thrilled that, you know, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking when somebody takes one of your favorite people and starts making a movie about it. And I have to say, I was really gratified with what they did with her story. I thought it was a great movie.
I'm really excited to see it. I kind of have a general thing and a specific thing. My general thing is that I've been enjoying reading on the roof as the weather has got better. We have access to a roof in the house that I live in, and I've been lying out there reading. And I will bring up on this podcast about one of my favourite books, another favourite book. I got to lie out there and read Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. And that's one of my favourite contemporary novels. And it had been a long time since I'd read something cover to cover. And I just lay out there for hours and gorged. And it's a wonderful, lyrical, unusual novel. And I love Emily St. John Mandel as an author. I highly recommend any of her fourth, fifth, or sixth novel I've read. They've all been excellent. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to have to check that out. And I wish we had a roof to sit out on. We do have a balcony which you can lie out on.
Please come chill on our roof with us, please.
We have a balcony with roses though, Rachel.
This is true.
You do.
But I love that we're coming into the warmer months and we can indulge in such pastimes.
Hedonistic pleasures. Yeah.
Other than that, I think this is time to wrap up our episode. Like I said, this will be the last episode until September, I believe. But fear not, we have quite a few episodes in the works. I always say this at the start of my breaks. I have hopes that I will record quite a few of them over the summer. I say this every time. You will hear me presumably in September say, I didn't record anything. But we shall hope and pray for a more organised Rachel.
Catch me bullying Rachel into reading something else for the next episode.
Yes. But in the meantime, if you want to keep up to date with us, and especially if you want to be alerted to when we come back, you can sign up to our newsletter, which is on my website, rachelsherlock.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at Risking Enchantment Podcast. Those are probably the best ways. I think I usually do manage to post it to Twitter or X, but I can't be totally relied on for that. So Instagram or our mailing list are the best ways to keep up to date. And I will wish you all a blessed, happy, holy summer. I hope
hopefully with lots of books read in sunshine.
Exactly. And thank you so much for listening. I am always so grateful to have such lovely listeners, and I am really grateful to be able to get to do this podcast, and I'm looking forward to coming back again soon. But I will, in the meantime, also enjoy the summer. So I will speak to you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
This has been Risking Enchantment.
Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.